And the gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess, for yielding me the customary 30 minutes. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks, and I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this closed rule and the underlying legislation. I want to begin by congratulating the Republican majority for breaking a record today. Through their exemplary, heavy-handed, undemocratic leadership, this is now officially the most closed session of Congress in the entire history of the United States of America. I'm not sure that's something to be proud of, but that's a title that they've earned. Today we are debating the 47th and 48th closed rules of the 114th Congress. We are in our third legislative week since Speaker Ryan took the gavel, and we are already debating our third and fourth closed rule during this short tenure. Speaker Ryan promised, and I quote, a more open, more inclusive, more deliberative, more participatory process, end quote. I think he must have misspoke, because by any measure, the Republican leadership has already fallen short of that commitment. Today, we are considering three bills. Two that seek to undermine the EPA's ability to protect our public health and environment, and a third that offers many troubling provisions, including one which would hastily rush the natural gas pipeline approval process and allow pipelines to be built and run right through our magnificent national parks. On December 11th, our government will run out of money. During the 114th Congress, we have stood in this chamber debating Republican messaging bills to repeal the Affordable Care Act, undermine the Dodd-Frank financial reform law, and weaken public health and environmental regulations while failing to consider meaningful legislation that would create jobs, boost the economy, and help vulnerable Americans rise out of poverty. Instead of focusing on these priorities, this majority will bring to the floor three bills intended to prevent the EPA from effectively doing its job. Now, if anyone is feeling deja vu, that's probably because what I just said is from a floor speech I gave on a rule for three anti-science bills that the Republicans brought before us last November. The only difference is I changed 113th to 114th Congress. And while I hate to repeat myself, unfortunately, the majority is in a rut of bringing before us the same old, unproductive legislation that is going nowhere. We have 6 legislative days left to ensure that the government doesn't run out of money, just 6 days. But instead of focusing on that, instead of working to ensure the government is funded, we are on the floor debating more Republican messaging bills that I think were written in the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee, because they're poorly drafted, and these bills would have drastic and devastating effects on public health and the environment, and they will be vetoed by the President of the United States. I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the statements of administration policies on both these bills, expressing the administration's intent to veto these bills.
Without objection.
But I guess that from the Republican point of view, the positive thing about these bills is that they are yet another pander to big-money fossil fuel special interests. So I urge my colleagues to follow the money, because that's what this is all about here today. It's not about serious legislating. It is about fundraising. So, Mr. Speaker, S.J. Res. 23 and S.J. Res. 24 look to stop common-sense regulations that the EPA has put in place that protect us from the harmful pollution emitted by power plants. These joint resolutions are another clear message from the Republican majority that they do not believe that climate change is real. Over 120 environmental, faith-based, and public health organizations have already come out opposing these two resolutions, including the American Lung Association, the Allergy and Asthma Network, the League of Conservation Voters, the National Resources Defense Council, the Sierra Club, and Public Citizen. And I could stand here forever and repeat the other organizations. that have a lot of public support in this country that have come out against these bills. Power plants account for 40% of our annual carbon pollution emissions. They are the single biggest source of carbon pollution in the country. Yet the Republican majority wants to take away the greatest step we have taken to try to curb that major source of pollution. These two joint resolutions would permanently prevent the EPA from ever limiting pollution from power plants in the future as well. H.R. 8 is also a deeply troubling piece of legislation. It favors the use of fossil fuels over renewable energy and favors consumption over energy efficiency. It would ram pipeline applications through FERC in under 90 days, even though most applications, by the way, are reviewed and approved in less than 1 year. But it all but removes individuals from the process, allowing big gas companies to choose to build wherever they want, regardless of the consequences for local communities. It would even allow them to build to our treasured national parks. It's an early Christmas gift for big special interests. You know, at some point, we must face the facts, Mr. Speaker. And I'd want to say something to my colleagues on the Republican side, and I know it may make you feel uncomfortable, but it's the truth. And that is, climate change is real. The overwhelming science says it is real. Yet a huge chunk of the Republican conference is in denial. They don't believe there is such a thing as climate change. They don't believe we have any responsibility to our children or to future generations to combat climate change. They are perfectly happy living in this fantasy world where you can where you can rely on fossil fuels and rely on fossil fuels and rely on fossil fuels and just make believe that it has no impact at all on the environment. And quite frankly, if climate change wasn't such a serious issue, it would be comical. But climate change is a serious issue. It is a real issue. It is an issue not just for us, it is an issue for future generations. So their denial, quite frankly, is frightening. It is frightening. We shouldn't be propping up coal and oil industries with taxpayer subsidies. We shouldn't be using taxpayer money to destroy our environment. When the scientific community reaches a clear consensus on an issue like climate change, Congress shouldn't undermine them with dangerous legislation like this. When we receive credible peer-reviewed study after study after study after study telling us that we are in the middle of a climate crisis and that something must be done about it, we need to listen. But the Republican majority refuses to listen. You know, climate change is often referred to as the most pressing issue of our time. We know that climate change is for real. We know that. We see it. We live it. And the scientific community has verified it. Climate change is not a theory. It's not a hoax. And it's certainly not some silly fantasy. When Arctic ice is crashing into the oceans at record rates, that is not a hoax. When species are going extinct at accelerated rates around the globe, that is not a fantasy. When extreme weather events are becoming commonplace, that is not a theory. And when the global temperature of the planet continues to increase every year for decades, we should pay attention. These are the exact same scare tactics that has been used for over 45 years in opposition to climate change. The same old stuff. Opponents of clean air have been claiming for half a century that clean air regulations would kill jobs and hurt economic growth. But they are wrong. The truth is the Clean Air Act alone has created $57 trillion in benefits since it was enacted in 1970. The Clean Power Plan will lead to a stronger economy, a safer climate, a better health for all of us. I mean, why is this so difficult? Maybe it's because my friends on the other side of the aisle don't like the president. So anything that he's for, they have to be against. But you got to move beyond your anger. You got to look at the issues, and you have to evaluate them based on the evidence. And the evidence is that climate change is for real. But you would never know that listening to the majority. They have no solutions, only denial. Let's keep on down the road of the same old, and their just say no agenda is a recipe for disaster. You know, as we gather here, leaders from all around the world are meeting in Paris to talk about how to deal with the issue of climate change. And what we should be doing here is providing some wind at the back, not only of our president, but of all the leaders of the world who are gathering to try to figure out how to deal with this challenge. And instead of doing that, we're doing this. It's really sad that this is what we've come to here. So if we're going to say no to anything today, it should be to this close rule and to SJ Res 23 and SJ Res 24. And with that, I